San Francisco just dominated the Pittsburgh Steelers in their Week 1 matchup, winning it 30-7. And this entire offseason, I've been talking about three main people that really have kept standing out to me. And those people are Brandon Ayuk, Drake Jackson, and Brock Purdy. And as you guys guessed, in this game, each one of these guys went off. Starting out with Brock Purdy, the quarterback for the Niners. This entire offseason, I kept getting told one thing, and that's Brock Purdy isn't a franchise quarterback. And well, come week 1, the Pittsburgh Steelers are going to shut him down and really make his life a living nightmare. And well, there was a living nightmare on the field, but it was more the Pittsburgh Steelers defense for Pittsburgh Steelers fans, because Brock Purdy was frankly just dicing up the Pittsburgh Steelers defense. And there were a couple of things that I really thought stood out on Brock Purdy's game. One of the biggest things is he's stepping up in the pocket and even completed a pass when he did this. But maybe more notably, many people criticize Brock Purdy on only completing passes within the first 10 yards, 5 yards, and just call him a dink or dunk quarterback. But in this game, he targeted Brandon Ayuk most notably deep down the field, and it was a beautiful deep down the field pass. It could have been thrown better. Another part about Purdy's game that keeps standing out is his athleticism, and not in a bad way. Purdy is extremely athletic. He steps up in the pocket, as I mentioned, but he even was able to escape later in the game and pulled out the slime move. I mean, this guy can do it all, or at least all that Kyle Shanahan is asking him to do, plus a little bit more. I mean, Kyle Shanahan just wants Brock Purdy to operate his offense efficiently. 30 points a game, and this is just a carryover from last year. Brock Purdy may have even improved a little bit, and that's insane considering he had to come back from his UCL tear, and many people thought he wasn't going to be the same quarterback, and I just got so much hate saying that I think Brock Purdy is the Niners' future franchise quarterback, and an elite one at that, and I still stand by that. The biggest thing that people are going to dock Brock Purdy on today is his stat line. Like it's going to be probably throughout this season, you see that Brock Purdy isn't going to be putting up 500 yards, and that's because Kyle Shanahan's offense isn't designed that way at all. When you look at Brock Purdy, he put up 220 yards with 2 touchdowns. He was an extremely efficient quarterback. He took shots when shots were needed. I mean, even when he almost had to fumble, he somehow pinned it behind his back and recovered it. It was insane. But let's talk about maybe someone else that stood out a little bit more than Brock Purdy on the stat sheet, and that was wide receiver Brandon Ayuk. He had 8 receptions, was targeted 8 times, caught all of them, had 129 yards, averaging 16.1 yards this game, and 2 touchdowns. Absolutely absurd numbers. Throughout this entire offseason, to me, Brandon Ayuk has looked like the Niners' number 1 wide receiver. I know Deebo Samuel is a fantastic football player, but I think as a pure wide receiver, Brandon Ayuk comes out as the number 1 wide receiver on the Niners roster. He's able to run his routes extremely crisply, and then he just breaks guys' ankles. It's really extremely fun to watch, but even when he's targeted downfield, let's take the play when Purdy targeted him deep, he was able to catch it. I mean, Brandon Ayuk has to be a top 10 wide receiver in the NFL. Then when you start throwing in more household names like Deebo Samuel, Christian McCaffrey, George Kittle, you realize this is going to be an absolute nightmare for defenses to defend throughout this season. The Niners even have some promising guys coming up the ranks like Ronnie Bell. Before we move into the defensive side of the ball, and speaking about the guy that really stood out there for me, and that's Drake Jackson, I do want to briefly touch on the Niners' offensive line. I think they performed well. They opened up holes in the run game, but they did give up a couple of sacks to Purdy, and that does need to be remedied going forward. Moving now from one line to the other in the Niners defensive line, someone that really impressed me today was Drake Jackson. He seemingly was able to get into the backfield non-stop. But before we talk about his day today, I do want to talk about, well, first, his offseason. During this offseason, Chris Kasarik, the Niners defensive line coach, spoke to Drake Jackson, and he challenged him to stack days. And did Drake Jackson ever? He was able to get extremely strong in the weight room, beating out personal maxes on bench, all sorts of things. And now, with his body completely reworked, he even spoke about this after the game, he was able to go off. But it wasn't from a starting role like I would suggest. I would thought he was going to go in and just start. But this isn't what the Niners decided to do. Rather, Clelin Ferrell seemed to be out there for the majority of reps on first and second down. And then, when they needed a pass rush, they sent in Drake Jackson. And he delivered each time, it seemed. The thing with Jackson that's always stood out to me is that he's had a ton of talent where he's gone. He was misutilized at USC, and that's why the Niners were able to pick him up with the second round draft pick. But his body wasn't ready to be in the NFL quite yet. So he needed some time in the strength and conditioning program, as I suggested, and so far, the early returns look like the strength and conditioning program has worked magic, and now the Niners have an opposite edge piece to Nick Bosa that's absolutely deadly. Clelin Ferrell also went off today, and let's talk about even Javon Hargrave, their new addition. Basically, the whole entire Niners defensive line ate. So while I highlighted the three guys that really performed up to my expectations in Drake Jackson, Brandon Ayuk, and Brock Purdy, I do want to talk about some other guys that stood out on the Niners defense and special teams. Wrapping up the Niners defense, I think three people stood out at each level. Starting out with the linebacking spot, the guy that stood out here was Fred Warner. He flew around sideline to sideline and made some brutal hits. Moving back now into the safety spots, Talanoa Hufanga laid out a brutal hit. He also had that nice interception and that pitch back, which was a cool play, but maybe next time I wouldn't pitch it. I don't know. It seems a little high risk, but Talanoa Hufanga is an absolute ball player. Now, moving into the cornerback spot, the guy that stood out here in a good way is Charvarius Ward. He seemed to be able to lock down people throughout the day and had that nice interception early on. So with dominating performances out of the way on the offense and defensive side of the ball, let's talk about the special team side of the ball. The big story this entire offseason has been kicker Jake Moody. He looked money in practice, but was shaky in the preseason. During this first week one, he was perfect and drilled everything. So that's encouraging. He wasn't handling kickoff duties today because he is coming back from that injury, and that leads us to speak about Mitch Wishnowsky. I think he had an extremely solid game and even had that nice little get-up play where he ran it, even though it was later called back. So even though the Niners did have strong performances out of their punter and kicker, an area where I think they need to improve going forward is their kick return coverage. It seemed like nearly today there was a couple of returns. If there was one more block, it could have been returned to the house by the Pittsburgh Steelers. If the Niners continue this kind of trend, a couple of these definitely will be returned. The Niners this game truly put on a dominating performance on the tape. No matter which way you look, the only area that has a question mark is that special teams kick return duty and the offensive line possibly. Other than that, I was pretty impressed by the Niners. I would give them an A+ for their performance. The offense seemed ready to go. The defense was ready to go. And that's something the Niners struggled with in the past, kind of getting out to a slow start. Brock Purdy was ready to put up 30 points a game, though. I'm impressed by this Niners unit. I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. It would also mean a ton to me if you liked and subscribed. And as always, I hope you guys have a good rest of your day.